Well, hello there, and welcome to another tank review. I'm Corny Swiss, and today we're looking at the M47, an American medium tank, rank 5, 8.0 battle rating. Now, as with all reviews, the various portions of this review will be time-stamped down below, so if you don't want to listen to a specific part, you can always just click away to a different part of the video and watch what you want to watch. But, if you want to hear the garage portion of the review, let's get started. So the M47 patent was another stopgap measure by the U.S. Army to kind of improve on the M40. The idea was that we needed something with better protection on the turret, and we were too far away from producing the next tank. I believe is the M42 or T4 or M42, yeah. So what they basically did is took an M46 and made it so they could fit the new turret on. But this is one of those tanks that there were a bunch made. Over 9,000 of these things were made, but the U.S. Army actually, or the U.S. military in general, never used them in combat. The Marines had them for a while, but they just never saw action because they were put in to service after Korea, at the very, very end of Korea, and then we had bigger, better things by the time Vietnam rolls around. However, lots and lots of these tanks ended up in the hands of our Cold War allies and were used in combat there. A lot of the other M47s, and there were a lot of them that met this fate, were used as target practice, live ammunition demonstrations for the tanks that would replace them, to demonstrate for example, the 105mm heat shell that was developed shortly after this tank, and brand new M47s were used as target practice because they just weren't needed anymore. You know, there were bigger, better things. Very well. It's interesting if you want it to be. This is actually the last American tank design with a bow-mounted machine gun. American tanks after this point will not have a bow-mounted machine gun. You know, there you go. Another little fact. But the M47, as it sits in War Thunder, like I said, rank 5, 8.0 battle rating. So top of the tree is 45.8 tons, 810 horsepower at 2,800 RPM, and it can do a max speed of 47 kilometers per hour. It's very similar to most American tanks in the sense that it won't be the fastest, but this thing it's pretty quick. It's agile, it's mobile, it can turn really well in neutral, and it actually doesn't. The hull traverse isn't that good in the lower gears if you're applying engine power, but so a lot of times you find yourself, if you're in the lower gears or not moving very fast, a lot of times you find it's better just to stop moving and turn the tank because you can do it so much faster. Maximum inclination 25 degrees, turret rotation speed 20.4 degrees a second. So that's fine. It's slower than Sherman's, but you know, that's a pretty quick turret for the 8.0 battle rating. There aren't many tanks that have 20 degrees per second turret rotation. Gun handling, 10 degrees of depression, 19 degrees of elevation. So the elevation's a little weak, but you don't need to raise the gun that much in this tank, and the depression is 10 degrees. That's pretty good. That's on par with some German tanks and better than a lot of its 8.0 competition. The big failing of the M47, though, and part of the reason why I maybe struggled to play it effectively was the armor. Right? The M47 is not endowed with very much armor. It's better than some, but it's certainly not good. So let's just start with the front of the hull. It's 101.6 millimeters. Sloped back, you know, it's in excess of 150, 160, all the way up to maybe 180. The issue is that most tanks that will see 8.0 competition have zero problem penetrating anything less than 200 millimeters. It's sort of when you get to 200 millimeters that armor becomes, when the effective thickness rather is 200 millimeters, that you start getting bounces and things like that. The front of this tank, the hull, generally won't bounce very many shots. The lower plate, 76.2 millimeters, that's sloped back, but it's still thinner than the upper plate. And also this machine gun port is kind of a gaping weakness in the front of your tank. It's basically as advertised armor, 101.6. You do have this section up here, which is 22 millimeters. However, it's sloped so ridiculously hard that it's more likely that the shell will just bounce when it hits that than it would if you just shot the upper plate. Now the turret is where you can find the thickest armor, and I have gotten bounces out of the turret, and I'll explain why. So you have a multi sort of layer construction for this turret. You have the sides of the turret, which are 63.5 millimeters, and it's this weird sort of oblong shape. Now that tapers down, and it's maybe 170 so millimeters at the minimum, except for on the sides of these ports here, which are basically as advertised. You have a gun mantlet, which is 114.3 millimeters. So effectively, it's a little bit sloped, so it's a little greater than that, maybe 150, 160 or so. On the top, it's almost 200, which is crazy. But behind that, you have another set of armor, which is 101.6 millimeters. And you'll notice that there is an overlap, a very slight overlap right in here, all the way around, that the first gun mantlet covers, and then the front of the turret also covers. Now, that does mean, though, that in the middle here, around the gun, there's only 114 or so millimeters of armor. Granted, it is sloped. And that's not covered by this plate. So this little sort of intersection here is, you can actually see it outlined just there. If I mouse over this, that intersection is actually in excess. I mean, you have 114 and 101. You have a lot of armor right there, and I've gotten very surprising bounces there. Also, I've been able to use the front of this turret to, you know, when someone's about to shoot at you, and you kind of just wiggle the turret, all of a sudden when they fire, and the shell will bounce, because this is armor that if you quickly angle, it can be effective. Right, but the key is in a straight-up face-to-face fight, you're going to get penetrated through the face. So the armor is not something you can rely on in this tank. Sides and rear are obviously the same. The side of the front section of the hull is 76.2. The back is 50.8. The sides of the turret, like I said, 63.5. Scroll around to the back, 76.2 on the back of the turret, but 50.8 in the back of the tank. So this thing is not blessed with armor, but it's not supposed to fit the sort of heavily armored role. This tank is very much so a shoot first, and once this tank is and it was historically it was designed as such. This tank is designed to get the first hit. The gun is designed to have the first penetrating hit on the enemy tank, right? And that's evidence in the ammunition choice that this gun gets. Right, but this thing isn't supposed to get into slugging matches, and you generally won't win slugging matches with any other tank in the game, unless they're so ridiculously lower tier than you. But everything this tank sees normally will give it be equal or better than it in a just straight up slugfest. Right, but let's talk about the gun, because the gun is where this tank sort of comes back into relevance. So let's pull up the ammunition chart, and you can see you have about 10 billion options. Start with the HE shell, because it's the first one I moused over. Don't bother with it. It's a low caliber it's a 90mm HE shell, but at this rank, that's extremely low caliber. There was a while where people were saying that it was the German 88 was just too low caliber to face 8.0 competition, and I agree to some extent. A 90mm is very similar to an 88, and HE shells just aren't effective with that caliber at this battle rating. They're effective against open top vehicles and like a ZSU or something like that, but what's also effective are other shells like this AP, for example. So no reason to use that. The default shot you get is this T-33 shot, and I mean, it's all right. It's almost entirely focused on flanking. When you have the T-33 shot, the M82 shot, you are a flanking medium tank. You need to get close, and you need to... Well, it's not even that you need to get close. You just need to be on their sides. And if they're angled, it's going to be really tough. Because the penetration values, 161 at 10 meters, 151 at 500, and 130 at 2,000 meters, means you can penetrate the side of every tank you'll see, except for IS-4s, which you will see in this tank. And So every tank other than an IS-4 and a mouse, now that I'm thinking about it, you'll be able to penetrate from the side. Now, granted, the rank 5 battle rating is loaded with IS-4s and mouse, so it's not a great shell, but it's what you have to start with. M82 shell, it has lower penetration, but it has the explosive damage effect, but it still puts you in the flanking medium, need to get close category. And it still, won't penetrate the same things that the T-33 shot will. Or won't, rather. They won't penetrate. Basically, the penetration charts are almost identical when it comes to the competition you face. The M304 shot is an APCR round, which is nice. APCR is generally the answer for mediums against heavies, in my opinion. And the penetration chart's pretty good. 254 millimeters at 10 meters, 241 at 500, and 171 at 2,000. Now, it basically means that this APCR shell has more penetration at all ranges than both of the AP shells, which is good. And this tank really, really needs to use either the APCR shell or the heat shell. I don't think you can get away with the AP shell, simply because the penetration just isn't good enough. I mean, German tanks will engage you at 1,000 meters, and you can't hurt them from the front. You have to get on their side, and it's very difficult to do that from 1,000 meters, right? Or from the positions that they're likely to be in. So, in my opinion, you need to beeline for the APCR, right? And 10,021 meters per second muzzle velocity is pretty good. Now, the M332 shot we've already seen before on other tanks, and the M304 shot the same way. And this is the round that I use generally standard. This is what I generally use for most situations when I'm using the M47. It's a smaller it's a lighter APCR shell by about 2 kilograms, but it has 100 meters per second more muzzle velocity, and the penetration chart is better. 269 at 10 meters, 250 at 500, 214 at 1500, and 182 at 2000 meters. Basically what this means is that the sides of, say, mouse, for example, you can penetrate fairly easily from very long range. With the AP shells, you can't do that, and the M304 shot, you can, but when you're already making the decision to use APCR, I feel like it's not that hard to use a higher penetration APCR. The damage effect is the same. The characteristics of the shell are basically the same. You're just going with more penetration, which I don't think is a bad thing. Now, if it was a 10 kilogram shell that had enough penetration to do the job versus a 4 kilogram shell that had way more penetration than was needed, then I would go with the 10 kilogram shell just because it's a heavier hit and it's more likely to fragment and things like that. But 2 kilogram difference, I'm not sure is big enough to justify the lack of the smaller penetration. And there are times when you need every bit of the penetration from this shell. But you do have a heat shell. It's the T108 shell, 853 meters per second muzzle velocity, and 210 millimeters penetration at all ranges. I generally find that this shell is effective when I'm engaging in sort of the closer quarters combat. And the reason I say that is 210 millimeters is pretty good, but it's generally not enough to get the job done at range. If a tank's angled, if you're fighting, say, T-54s, and the T-54 angles his front plate or doesn't even, it's not guaranteed that you'll penetrate with this heat shell. All right, I've had times where my heat shell hasn't penetrated the front of a T-54's upper plate. Now, the M332 shot will penetrate most of the time, almost, I would say 80% of the time, at decent range. So I keep a stock of this, but I generally use the M332 shot just because it has better performance, in my opinion, dealing with targets than the heat shell does. But this is a worthwhile shell to have on your tank because it can be useful, and I have found it useful in a few situations. And those situations arise enough that I feel comfortable devoting some of my loadout to it. I think I usually go with about 20 rounds of this and the rest M332 shot. And I generally don't need that much ammunition, but you know, let's just fill it up. Why not? Advantage though is the heat shell is way less expensive, 170 lines versus 520. So if you're trying to make money off this thing, that may be where you can cut some costs. Is ditch 400, almost 400, well 350 credits per shot, and just use the heat shell, which is, you know, effective most of the time, just not all the time. That's something you need to keep in mind. Now with a decent crew, you can manage I've managed a 11.2 second reload. It obviously can be much faster than that. And overall, the gun performance is very good. With the APCR round, you can penetrate just about everything at range. And it's generally what I feel you need to use when you're engaging at range. The heat shot I don't think gets it done. But, you know, you should try both and see which one you like better. So that's the gun. And you'll find that the gun it's effective. Right, it's your classic harassing medium tank. It's not a big, super punchy gun like the T-54s, where you just sort of run up and, you know, shoot people and they die. The M47, you need some finesse with it. You need to hit certain locations. You need to sort of, you almost wound them with the first hit, take them out with the second, or disable critical components and then eventually knock them out. You're not generally going to go for get those one-shot kills, because it's just not, the gun just doesn't seem to be designed for that, whereas the T-54's gun kind of is. But it gets an AP shell that has good penetration, and it just hits really hard. So, you know, there's a key difference there. In terms of layout, there's not a whole lot special about the layout of the M47. You have the driver sitting here, you got the machine gunner, you got the gunner, loader, and commander sitting in the back, and the ammo is stored in the floor. Right, so I guess if you wanted to, you know, shoot here for an ammo explosion, but I find that usually just shooting it in the side of the turret will get the job done. If you're engaging this thing from the front, you can go for the lower plate ammo rack, or you can just shoot it right down the middle. Depends what you're shooting at this thing. If you're shooting APCR, it's very likely the shell won't fragment, and you'll just hit the engine, so you might want to aim for the lower part of the tank. Or maybe maybe through the driver's head and into this ammo compartment here. But if you're firing an AP shell, just hit it center of mass, like kind of in the middle of the lower plate, or maybe even the sides of the turret, and you know, where the loader or the gunner is, and you'll knock this thing out. If you're firing a high caliber shell, like 122, 128, just hit this thing somewhere in the front, and it'll knock it out. This thing isn't the most durable tank you've ever seen. But that being said, it's not a bad tank, and hopefully the replays can kind of show you what I've been talking about. So let's move on to the replays, shall we? So here we are in a realistic battle on Cuban. And realistic battle, you have mixed teams. You have more of an arcade style matchmaker where anyone can be on your team. Which means that the M47 is going to face American tanks, it'll face Russian tanks, it'll face German tanks. It'll also be teamed with American tanks, Russian tanks, and German tanks. So realistic battle's kind of balanced in that way. It's kind of balanced how arcade is balanced, where one OP tank, there's just probably a lot of it in the game, not necessarily all on one team though. But I'm coming over here to start harassing enemy tanks as they move forward. And this replay, I think, is going to, in my opinion, really demonstrate the most effective playstyle for this tank. I'm sure you can get away with sometimes being very aggressive and moving into really, really advanced flanking positions and things like that. But sometimes just sitting on a ridge, or, see, that was a lucky bounce. Like, holy cow. Basically, I'm pretty sure what happened there is he hit the mantlet where the armor overlaps. And I got away with one. But I'm reloaded. I know he's not. So I can take another shot. It misses, which is unfortunate. But now I need to relocate. Relocating is going to be really important in this tank, because you can't show up in the same spot every time, or else they're going to time you out. They're going to, you know, just be waiting for you. And then you'll show up right where they expected, and they'll just blast you. So you don't want to do that. And there's a friendly neighborhood king tiger over here who is going to be a very nice target for the enemy team. I would much rather him take hits than me, but that's always true. What's the quote about teammates? Teammates are targets for the enemy, and the more you have around you, the more likely they are to get shot than you are. So that's not a bad thing. Now this king tiger is trying to get shots on the enemy tanks over here, sort of in the western part of the map, and I am too, which is convenient. And basically me and this king tiger are going to be backing up, reversing, things like that, taking pod shots, and he's going to actually draw some of the shots that could have been meant for me, but are instead going to be fired at him, which is always nice. And I'm going to accidentally sort of brush him a little bit. Ooh, there we go. APCR can be a very effective tank killer. Now I'm going to kind of poke out a little bit more. There's a mouse over there I would really like to shoot. Oh, he was looking right at us. And I was able to sort of dodge out of the way there. I accidentally bumped him, which is, you know, a little unfortunate, but it didn't change anything. Just kidding. See, it's like a heat shell wouldn't have penetrated that either. See, and actually, I mean, the side of the mouse turret is 200 millimeters, and it's kind of angled right there. So a heat shell wouldn't have done the job anyway. And if this APCR shell didn't do the job, then this wasn't meant to penetrate that shot. But what's kind of happening is the enemy have sort of bottlenecked themselves in a way, and we have plenty of tanks dealing with that sort of the face of their advance. And we also have some supporting tanks like myself and this king tiger who are causing some problems. But I'm going to decide to not sit there anymore and move over into this little ditch to start engaging some other targets. It's an M47 who was spotted over there. It's a tank I'd like to shoot. But this is sort of, now this isn't, ideally I would have probably moved forward here, but I'm going to spend a little bit longer sitting here than I probably should have. And the scorecard at the end isn't going to be great, but I feel like a great scorecard in tanks like the M47 and things like that are more a function of your team just didn't one-shot tanks. You know, your team took hits for you, and you were able to take advantage of that. Because, you know, the armor's not great, and without armor, especially in War Thunder, less so in World of Tanks, you become even more prone to being one-shot, which is very sad. And the difference between being hit in World of Tanks and being hit in War Thunder is being hit once can basically end your game, and being hit that's in War Thunder. In World of Tanks, being hit once just means you need to move, or you need to reposition, or you need to do something differently, or you need to angle a little bit more. You get more second chances, basically, or maybe even not even just second chance, maybe third, fourth, fifth chance. In War Thunder, you get punished way harder for making a mistake when it comes to positioning yourself to take incoming fire. And the best way to play medium tanks like the M47, like the Bulldog's technically a light tank, and the Panther II, things like that, is just to never get shot at, to never take a hit, right? There's tanks like the IS-4 and the Mouse that are designed to take hits, and those tanks are very, very good at taking hits. But you always find that the most effective gameplay for specifically medium and light tanks is to never get hit, ever. And you really need to be careful when you're driving the M47 around to avoid that. But now we've sort of cleaned out the enemy presence in the western part of the map. Now we're pushing down towards their cap, and we're basically going to try and clean up the southern part of their team. There are still some enemy tanks sitting down in those sort of valleys and gullies where some of our tanks are starting to push in. But for due diligence, we need to be sure that there aren't enemy tanks over here, and there will be. Myself and this king tiger are back together, and oh, there's a Is that a, what is that? It's an M26, I believe. If I remember right. Yeah. First shell. Goes in, hits some ammo, wounds the loader. Not a particularly great hit. The gun mantlet on the M26 is actually not bad. But he saw this King Tiger who's with me, and there's a Panther too as well. So we're going to need to be a little bit careful and trying to, and this is kind of what you have to do. They're watching the King Tiger. The King Tiger is a way bigger threat to them than I am. So they're both going for him, and I kind of sneak out to the side, put a nice little shot into the Panther 2, set him on fire. So that's good. And because I'm now sitting over here, the M26 has to worry about two different sort of attacks. And he got blasted by a Dornier somehow. I don't know how that happened. Maybe the explosion, maybe a bomb explosion didn't register. And the Panther 2 was also knocked out. So you're going to get a lot of assists in this tank, because you're not likely to outright kill someone. You're more likely to damage them, and then sort of your team, the guys with the bigger guns, are going to blast them or take the advantage of the opportunity type thing. Like for example, there's lots of situations where putting your teammates in a position to. I was just looking at something really quick on the front of my tank. Is that where the shell actually hit? There's lots of positions you can find yourself in where you doing one thing is what needs to happen to either win the game or kill those tanks in front of you. For example, if you're in a mouse, maybe you need to go up over the hill, take a hit, hits from all those tanks, because they're inevitably going to shoot the first thing that comes over, and then your team will go over and kill them. Right? That's kind of your job. The M47, I feel like its job is to harass the enemy and put them in a position to be vulnerable against other tanks. Like, for example, M103s and things like that. Things that have the bigger guns to deal with threats, but don't really want to take the first hit either. And a lot of times an M47 can be fast enough, maneuverable enough to swing out on the flank and draw enemy fire at least away from the team. But hopefully not get hit. IS-4 here just got knocked out just as I was getting here, which is a little sad. But this is, I feel like this game is representative of how to play the M47. Now, you can obviously do much better than I did. And I had better replays, or quote-unquote better, where, you know, I got more kills or, you know, whatever, I had a higher score. But they really, I felt like they were more down to luck rather than playing this tank the way I think it should be played. So I decided to include this replay. But now we're going to take the triumphant march back to the cap circle, hopefully not get bombed, and win the game. But the big thing to remember with the M47, I've said it probably a billion times by now, you don't have the armor to take the hits for everyone else. You need to let other people take the hits. It's a lot like Hellcats in World of Tanks. Just because you can get to the front doesn't mean you should be at the front. And the M47 is a good representation of that. There are a lot of situations where you'll find yourself near the front, especially if you use the speed of this thing, but you really, really should wait for some other tanks to show up. For example, on Kursk, just because you can get to the cap circle or get to the top of the hill first and start engaging, doesn't really mean you should. Maybe you should take a little bit more time to flank around a little bit more while your heavier tanks get up to the ridge or whatever. So that way when the enemy starts shooting, you can engage them from a different angle and avoid being shot back at. And just because I could, shot the mouse. Game was over, so whatever. So that was kind of a representative game of how I think the M47 should be played. And obviously you can have much better results than I did. I didn't have particularly great results, but there are plenty of games. You'll find that if this tank is a tank you enjoy, you'll have plenty of good games. It's a solid tank. It's just the playstyle isn't something I really enjoy. But let's move on to the simulator gameplay, shall we? So here we are in a simulator battle, driving the M47 on Karelia, or not Karelia, it's Carpathians, duh. But it's a simulator battle. There aren't a ton of players in this game in its conquest game mode, which means that there's one center cap, dead center in the middle of the field there. Now, this is, both replays I think that I've brought are representative of sort of how the M47 wants to be played. It's all about, the armor I think really limits you in the chances you can take and things like that. Like T50, when you drive a T54, you can do a lot of different things that you wouldn't be able to do in other tanks. But when you're driving the M47, you have to be mindful of what you're doing, what you're showing the enemy and things like that. So my plan here in the beginning of the map is I'm going to run up on top of this hill. We have a tank, we had one friendly I believe go around the side. I'm going to come up here and overwatch the cap circle. I'm figuring that if the enemy are going to, well, it's depending. If there's Russian tanks on the enemy team, then they're likely either rushing this hill or rushing the cap. Either way, I need to be up here. Or if it's German tanks, they're probably not even out of their spawn yet, so we can safely come up here. But I'm going to come on up here, take a poke around, and there's a bunch of enemy tanks moving onto that hill over there. Presumably to watch the cap and try and kill us there. So I'm trying to finagle my way into finding shots on those guys. You can see my loadout, I have the heat shells and the APCR shells loaded. And I'm going to be using an APCR shell first. Do little poke moves. Oh, see him. What is that? It's a Jagdtiger. And first shot hits the loader. Now, this is a situation where if that shot had been AP, then he may have died. But ultimately I was firing APCR and I didn't kill him. Nice hit into the side of the King Tiger there. Unfortunate that the ammo rack didn't get set off, but that's another sort of downside to APCR, and maybe why you choose to use the heat shell. Honestly, like for example, I think if that was a heat shell, I think that guy would have died, because heat shells would have a better chance, I believe, of cooking off the ammo rack. But these are all the things you need to take into account. Now for the front of this tank, I absolutely need APCR. At this range, it'd be much better to use APCR than heat, because it's not unlikely, I believe, to penetrate the front of that tank with the heat shell. Gonna take out a couple of these, gonna take out this AI. I want to keep the top of this hill kind of clean, so that if someone does show up here, I'll be able to see him. And that would be nice. You know, I don't want anyone to sneak up on me up here. Set him on fire. Now I'm gonna re-poke, looking for a hit. Oh, there's that Jagdtiger. Got a nice hit into his lower part of the tank. Hit his transmission. Looks like it got one of his crew members as well. Gonna take a step back. Go for the fire shot on this AI here. And then gonna wait for the reload. And then try and poke out and see what we can't see. Now, because we got to the cap so quickly, and because the enemy tanks are sort of held down, there goes the Jagdtiger. The enemy weren't ever really able to sort of do anything, I guess is the best way to say it. We basically took the cap and then just harassing fire from myself and other tanks was able to keep them away. And that's where this tank really shines, is the ability to harass the enemy at long range and sort of unexpectedly. Now there's a tank over there. Oop, quickly. Oof, would have been nice. But now I'm reloading. And the key thing about the M47 is, like, I don't want to be up here, honestly. I'd much rather be down there duking it out around the cap circle. But honestly, this is where this tank really shines, is when you can keep the enemy sort of away and have them shooting at someone else. For example, not a single shot has come my way this entire game. And that's kind of how it should be for the M47 to really do well. Now there's a Ferdinand over there. There's his there's some dust kicked up. Oh, there he is. went for the front plate shot because the APCR has plenty of penetration to deal with the front of a Ferdinand. Gonna try and get another hit into him. I'm gonna set him on fire, but no, the game ended. It's a very quick game, and it's primarily because we took the cap so quickly, but also because once we did take the cap, it was impossible for them to ever come near the cap ever again. And that's something the M47 can do because it has a quick rate of fire, and you can just pin people down with incessant amounts of fire. But anyway, let's move on to the final opinion, shall we? Alright, so opinion time. What do I think of the M47 Patton? It's another one of these tanks that really wasn't my thing. It wasn't a style of play that I really enjoy, but it's a solid tank. The issue it runs into is it doesn't stack up well against its primary medium tank competition, the T-54, but there aren't many tanks that do. Also, now that we have the mouse in the game, you see a lot of mouses, you see a lot of IS-4s still, you know, IS-3s, T-54s, that type of stuff, King Tigers, and the M47 can deal with all those. The IS-4 is really, really tricky for this tank. It's tricky for all tanks, but the IS-4 bases its entire existence on the sloping of its armor. Its armor isn't that thick. It's 160 millimeters, which, you know, I guess is kind of thick, but it's sloped back so hard that it becomes very difficult to penetrate. And sloped armor is sort of an issue for APCR. It doesn't dig in the right way that an AP shell would. So that being said, you know, most tanks need to use APCR to deal with IS-4s anyway. And I have killed IS-4s in this tank, but generally from the side, or maybe generally my strategy is if I have to engage him from the front, I try and go for the little driver's hatch, or I shoot his gun out and then close the distance. But yeah, you need to be careful when you're dealing with IS-4s in this tank. With mouses, I have killed a mouse with this tank. It's difficult because if a mouse is angled, it's very difficult to destroy anyway. But this tank can actually be hurt by the being hit by a mouse basically means you're dead. I was trying to say that better, but if you get hit, you're basically dead against, well, IS-4 or a mouse. So this tank needs to be sort of on the perimeter and engaging flanking actions, not being the center of attention, and sort of letting other people soak up hits. Now that realistic battle seems to have more of an arcade matchmaker, it means that you could have mouse on your team or IS-4s on your team. Let them go forward and take the hits. Don't do it yourself. Just because this thing is kind of mobile, don't go to the front. Because if you go to the front, you're going to get hit once and knocked out. It's better to let other people sort of draw attention and then sneak out and, you know, pop a couple. It's very similar to the Walker Bulldog play style. It's a very, very similar machine, now that I think about it. Its armor isn't adequate for the job, but has a good gun, has the penetration, can be a serious problem. So take that as you will. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it helped. I hope if you have any questions or anything like that, or maybe suggestions for future reviews, go ahead and put them in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to read them and answer back to all your questions and concerns or whatever. So thanks for watching. I've been Corny Swiss, and I'll see you next time.